Well, President Cyril Ramaphosa says he'll use the G7 Leaders Summit to lure investors to South Africa. Ramaphosa is set to attend the 47th G7 Summit. It's going to be held in the UK later this week, with a global recovery from COVID-19 likely to top the agenda. He's revealed this in his weekly newsletter published Monday morning, also highlighting some of the issues that South Africa is grappling with. The country's presented so many economic recovery plans, but are they actually bearing any fruit? Well, for more on this then, we can speak to Dr Lumkile Mondi, economist and senior lecturer at the Wits University. Good to speak to you, Mr. Mondi. So, South Africa now invited, along with South Korea, India and Australia, to attend the G7 summit in the UK later this week. How much can actually be achieved from such an invitation and one meeting?
Quite a lot. Remember that us and India are holding the world at a ransom, given the high levels of infection of COVID-19. So therefore, any economic recovery, particularly the tourism, hospitality and aviation sectors, are very much dependent on a world that is free of COVID-19. So this meeting presents an opportunity for us in India, who've been pushing for the relaxation of intellectual property rights so that we can be allowed to produce domestically the vaccine to get it going for our economies and the rest of the world. So yes, I think we're going to make and shake those rooms, those boardrooms, us and India, in the next few days when we meet in London with the G7 partners.
And President Ramaphosa does say that this trip will be used to further advance the argument for the waiving of the IP rules on COVID-19 vaccines. But here's the difficulty. Some of the big wealthy countries who are part of the G7 have already expressed their opposition to that idea because they poured in billions into the development of these vaccines. Do you think an economic argument will be what finally sways them?
It is to do with the fact that there's excess supply already in the U.S. market, for example. The U.S. went big around procuring both the Moderna as well as Pfizer vaccines and later Johnson & Johnson. As we know that the Baltimore plant, that is a subject in Gqeberha at Aspen, of how many of those are contaminated. So I think most of the world has moved quite rapidly in vaccinating. They are sitting with excess supply of stock. So I think what they're going to do to push back the argument of relaxing the intellectual property rights is to really say, you know what, we can actually supply to you these vaccines without you having to produce. So we're going to see quite a lot of support and supply to many emerging and developing economies by this excess vaccine that many of the developed world has, because their government put their people first, which Ramaphosa and his government failed dismally by not taking those tough decisions of really spending money to procure, to ensure that at least all South Africans are vaccinated, so that you can deal with the burning problems of unemployment and poverty and inequality in South Africa. So South Africans really are going to get a favor of this free vaccine coming from the West, but they won't deal decisively to the problems that many South Africans face that I've mentioned because of the failure of the Ramaphosa government.
And on the IP waivers, of course, the next obvious hurdle will be when that vote takes place at the World Trade Organization, where it's going to need unanimous approval. But I want us to talk to the issue of South Africa's economics. In the last week alone, we heard that unemployment has worsened in the country, both officially and unofficially, when you look at those various statistics. You've got an issue of all the industries, or at least most of the industries in this country, that are still battling to recover from the impact of COVID-19 and the subsequent lockdowns. When the president says South Africa is going to try and lure investors, how steep of a hill will they have to climb?
I think he's a salesperson. I doubt that South Africa remains pro-investment in terms of its environment. Remember, South Africa is a failing infrastructure. If you look at the railway infrastructure, you look at the road infrastructure, water infrastructure, energy infrastructure, the ANC has completely mismanaged the inheritance it got from the apartheid regime. So every day that passes, South Africa becomes a hard sell, not only to foreign investors, but to us, domestic investors, as well as the population at large. I don't think that the ANC has shown its ability of being fit to govern, and therefore the easiest way of really winning hearts and minds of foreign investors is by winning your domestic investors, and as well as your domestic households. I think at this juncture, really, the ANC government is failing dismally. So I think good luck to him. He can go and sell, but really, he's talking to a world that understands the challenges that we're facing of corruption, of continuous power failures, and matters of business people, as we've seen, and Richards Bay recently.
And just on that, interesting that you point out the ANC government's failures, because in the newsletter today, President Ramaphosa says, and I want to quote from the letter, "We do not take the patience and resilience of the South African people for granted. We acknowledge our shortcomings as a government and are working to remedy them." A lot of South Africans watching this conversation will then roll their eyes at that. Are you among them?
I'm among them. The first thing that he could deal with is his Minister of Health. All of us have read, not only now, we knew as far back as when he was in KZN as the Minister of Economic Development and Finance. So, you know, it's really a continuation of where there's malfeasance and corruption, and that impacts on the millions of the lives of South Africans. Nothing gets done at all to resolve any suspicion. So really, of course, because South Africa has failed to deal with the problems of racial divisions, of economic marginalization, parallel of black people, the ANC will continue playing this game of black against white and getting votes at the polls, and appears to be winning at the polls, whilst in fact all of us, our experiences are dismal. So as I've said earlier, this morning I didn't have water, I had power cuts, there's potholes in my streets. So this is the reality that as a domestic South Africans, and I think many are facing the same. So there's so much of talk by the Ramaphosa regime and promises and smiles, but very little of taking the decisive decision.
I suppose we're all facing them at varying degrees, because many of the people who live in the poorest parts of South Africa, including townships and rural areas, will say, well, we've been waiting for years for the lights to come on. They still haven't come on. But the president then addressing a sentiment such as yours says, we've actually become so absorbed with our shortcomings that we've lost sight of all that's being done. Do you agree?
We have not. What has been done? What's been done is the destruction of infrastructure. So if you live in Soweto, not only you don't have electricity today, you don't have means of having a choice of traveling from Pivot to Johannesburg because the rail infrastructure has failed. Because of the continuous complaints and marches in the township, most of the infrastructure has also been destroyed by continuous boycotts. So if you look, for example, the new road between Moroka and Noordgesig in Soweto has been damaged because the citizen has been burning tires on the new infrastructure, and therefore that infrastructure has been destroyed. That means that the policing and trust between government and the population has really been undermined. So there's a complete mistrust across all areas. And when there's mistrust, it's because the leaders are failing. So leaders succeed when they can convince people that they've got their interest at heart. And having their interest at heart is being present all the time to address their problems. Not when elections are coming around, they see you. When things are tough, as they are in Soweto, for example, where there's been no electricity for weeks in many areas. This is the time when it counts. And I think this government really has taken the racial past anger by people for granted. And unfortunately, for many who want progress in this country, the ANC will continue being voted because of the racial past. However, the dismal of dealing with inequality, poverty, and unemployment remains, as well as the capability whether will it ever be able to address these problems, which I doubt. And it's time for really reorganization of political force in South Africa than what we're seeing of the traditional parties that continue to reinforce the inequality unemployment and poverty of many Black South Africans.
All right, Dr. Lumkile Mondi, economist and senior lecturer at Wits University. Good to speak to you, sir. Thank you.